Starting in session 80, we're going to be dealing with the next several sessions, squares and square roots. As a quick reminder, we're going to go over some of the basics, and then those basics will help us as we calculate those equations that have algebraic expressions in them, including the squares and square roots. Y equals x squared. Here's our first equation. In this equation, there's a particular number that's going to equal some other number squared. In this example here, y is called the square of x, and x is called the square of y. Let's go ahead and stick in a number here and see what that means. Let's say y is 100. 100 equals what number squared? In other words, what number times itself equals 100? Well, 10 does. Therefore, 100 is the square of 10. But likewise, 10 is called a square root of 100. Let's choose another number. Let's choose 81. Y is 81. 81 equals what number squared? Well, 81 equals 9 squared. 9 times 9 is 81. Therefore, 81 is the square of 9, and 9 is a square root of 81. Separate example here, 64 equals x squared. We're going to do this mentally. What number squared equals 64? Well, that's going to be an 8. Is that the only answer, though? No, it's not. There's also one more answer. The other answer is negative 8. Because remember, when you take a negative number and you multiply it by another negative number, you're going to get a positive answer. Minus 8 times minus 8 is a positive 64. So we can see here that in this equation there are two solutions, 8 and negative 8. Well, let's use that same 64 here, but this time we're going to write it as a square root. This square root symbol, it looks similar to a division symbol, but the square root symbol has that extra horizontal line and diagonal slash before it. This square root symbol is called a radical sign. So this can either be pronounced radical 64 or the square root of 64. Well, moving on here, the square root of 64 we already determined from the previous screen is 8 and negative 8. But let's say that the particular problem is wanting us to give the negative number that's a solution to this square root problem. In order to do that, mathematicians have come up with a method that says whenever you have a negative sign before a square root, what that means is give us the negative answer. So here we have a minus sign, a negative sign before our square root of 64. So what this is asking us for is give us the negative answer for the square root of 64. Well, that would be negative 8. If there is no symbol outside up front, this is normally asking us then for the positive answer. So what we need to come over here and do is remove that second answer there. The square root of 64 here would be 8, whereas the negative square root of 64 would be minus 8. So once again, that simply means to give us the negative answer for this. And if you wanted to visualize it or take it one step further, you could say, well, the square root of 64 is 8. What's the opposite of 8? The opposite of 8 is negative 8. Okay, let's take a look at another one here. This particular problem, the square root of 10. Is the answer to that question a whole number? Is it a positive integer? In other words, does it come out even without any remainders or any decimal places or any fractions or anything like that? Well, no, it doesn't, and you can quickly prove that to yourself. Start at the bottom. What's your first whole number greater than 0? Your first integer? It's 1. What's 1 squared? 1 squared is 1. Take your next integer, 2. 2 squared is 4. Take your next integer, 3. 3 squared is 9. We're not to our 10 yet, are we? We're only up to 9. But if we go up to our next integer, 4, 4 squared is 16. So offhand, you know a couple things. First of all, the square root of 10 does not have an even answer to it. But you also know, by doing the method that we just did, which two whole numbers, which two integers is the answer to the square root of 10 going to be between? Well, we know that the square root of 9 is 3. So we know that our answer is at least as big as 3. But we also know that the square root of 16 is 4. So the square root of 10 is going to be greater than the square root of 9, but less than the square root of 16. So which two integers is this answer going to be between? It's going to be between 3 and 4. Now, before we go on any further, can you make a guess? Is the square root of 10 going to be closer to 3, or is the answer to this going to be closer to 4? Well, if you take a look here, the square root of 9 is 3. That's the first integer right before 10. 10 is very close to 9, where 10 is not very close to 16. 10 is 1 away from 9, but 10 is 6 away from 16. So by guessing, we can make a deduction here that the answer, 3 point whatever, is going to be closer to 3 than it is to 4. And the reason why we illustrate this is that oftentimes when you're calculating out the exact square root of something, it's not going to be an even answer. There's going to be decimal places in it. And it's oftentimes helpful to know which two numbers that the answer is going to be between. It's helpful to double check problems. It's helpful to see if the answer that you came up with is realistic. So just remember that you can determine which two integers this particular answer is between by finding out the square, the biggest square before 10 and the biggest square after 10. Well, the biggest square before 10 is 9, and the biggest square after 10 is 16. So that method is helpful as you calculate algebraic expressions with squares and square roots. As a review then, for session 80, y equals x squared. In this expression, y equals x squared, y is called the square of x, and x is called the square root, or a square root of y. And our second point here, this radical sign, the square root sign, the square root symbol is called a radical sign. Down here we have radical 41. That means the positive square root of 41. And negative square root of 41, negative radical 41 means the negative square root of 41. Okay then, that's your review for session 80.